On Sunday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd traveled from Poland across Ukraine to the capital, Kyiv, for face-to-face talks with the country's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. That's the highest-level U.S. visit since the start of the Russian invasion. Ukraine has been pressing Western allies for heavier weapons to fight Russia's campaign in the east. Now, military aid has started to flow. The U.S. diplomats pledged another $700 million in military aid and said Washington would reopen its embassy in the Ukrainian capital.
A warm welcome back to Kyiv after a secretive train journey across the Polish-Ukraine border to the capital. The high-level delegation sent by U.S. President Joe Biden to offer face-to-face messages of support and admiration.
The reason we're back is because of you, because of the extraordinary courage, leadership, and success that you've had in pushing back this horrific Russian aggression.
Both Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd offered Zelenskyy condolences for the loss of life in Ukraine and further economic and military support. As ever, Zelenskyy was grateful, then to the point about his needs. The priorities are weapons and support from the United States and our partners, from European leaders, in terms of our Army's strength and support in certain areas. Zelenskyy was quick to point out the U.S. has already given billions in assistance since Russia's invasion and repeated his military must have top-level armaments if it is to beat back the invader in places like the Donbas region, where Russia has tried to reinvigorate its efforts to achieve changing goals in Ukraine. Its focus no longer Kyiv, the capital, but the east and southern coast of Ukraine. Safely back across the Polish border after the meeting, Austin said Ukraine can be victorious over Russia.
In terms of their ability to win, the first step in winning is believing that you can win. And so they believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. They can win if they have the right equipment, the right support. And we're going to do everything we can, continue to do everything we can to ensure that that gets.
Austin and Blinken together announced a further $700 million in military support for the Ukraine cause before Austin moved on to Ramstein, Germany, for a meeting with NATO defense ministers.
Let's take a close look at this with Joshua Schifferinson, who's an associate professor of international relations at Boston University. He's an expert in U.S. foreign policy and the history of the Cold War. Welcome to DW. Let's start with General Austin there. Some people would listen to what he said and wonder if he's being overly optimistic, talking about Ukraine being able to win this war. And I'll tell you why I ask, because whichever way the cards fall, the post-conflict decades are likely to be filled with massive insecurity for whoever thinks they've come out on top.
Yes, I think that's doubly right, in fact. Number one, I think Secretary Austin might be a little overenthusiastic in estimating Ukraine's ability to push Russia back out of the Donbas and the southern coastline. And then number two, as you were alluding to, we are facing a renewed period of insecurity in Europe, the likes of which we haven't seen in over 3 decades. And so the notion of Ukraine winning against Russia right now, that's a short-term victory. The question of what happens after this remains highly uncertain.
And so we have Secretary Blinken and General Austin arriving in Ukraine with Joe Biden's good wishes and a multi-million-dollar checkbook for Ukraine to have pretty much anything it wants except a no-fly zone. Is President Biden right to draw the line there?
Yes, in my opinion, he is entirely right to join the line there. Right now, the U.S. is arming Ukraine. It is preparing Ukraine to resist and push back against Russian aggression. But a no-fly zone would mean that the U.S. and presumably the other NATO allies are actually fighting Russia over Ukraine. That could very well lead to the World War III scenario that President Biden alluded to in various speeches and which we should all be highly concerned about.
OK, we're going to hear from the U.S. Defense Secretary and then come back to you.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability. and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability.
So Joshua Schifferinson, there's General Austin there. It sounds like he's really asking Ukraine to try and make up for the United States underestimating Vladimir Putin's ambition all these years.
Well, so I think that could be part of it. And certainly the U.S. has been arming Ukraine quite heavily, providing significant economic and military diplomatic assistance since the war began. And I agree with you that part of this is a mea culpa campaign for underestimating the Russian threat for a while. But there's another element there, which I think goes to a point you raised a few minutes ago, which is if we think that Russia is going to be a challenge for the foreseeable future, any steps that we can take now that would weaken Putin over the long term, weaken Russia over the longer term, rebounds to the Western advantage. So this is the opening salvo, and I think a longer-term competition that also is also future-oriented as much backwardly oriented.
Yeah, this is going to go in all sorts of directions because how much is this war a sort of wake-up call then for US foreign policy? And once we're out of this mess, how is US foreign policy likely to sort of pivot and change?
Well, so I actually think that U.S. foreign policy right now is very much focused on the Russia threat. But over time, we're going to see the U.S. continuing to pivot towards China. Even Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks today gave a speech that alluded to the U.S. continuing focus upon China. But what I think we're going to see going forward is a renewed NATO-wide effort to focus on Russia, with the U.S. providing the strategic leadership, but increasing contributions from many European members of NATO. So this is going to be a continued focal point, even if it isn't the main focus of American resources.
OK. Next question in two parts, if I may. Let's imagine Russia wins this war, however messily. Where would that then leave it in the world? A member of the UN Security Council, but probably still under international sanctions, with countries still desperate to buy its gas, despite their reservations?
Yes, I think the only thing, I think it is quite worrisome what a Russian victory means in this context, not just because defeating Ukraine would be an affront to the international community, would not just be problematic for Russia, but that Russia's isolation is going to be quite profound in a political sense, even if it is economically still intertwined with the world. This is a recipe for disaster. We're talking about there a country that has massive economic resources, a lucrative commodity in its oil and gas exports, and yet is on the out of many members of the international community. This is a recipe for long-term instability that a Russian victory is in some ways almost worse than a Russian defeat, or as bad as a Russian defeat.
And we have this at the sort of the end of a sort of a trail of Russian movement over the last 10 years, where it's striven to put itself at the centre of world affairs, displacing the US as the key player in Syria, for example, and increasing Vladimir Putin's in the Middle East. But Russia's incompetence in this war does seem to have undermined that image somewhat.
Yes, so I think I would frame Russia's goals a little differently. Russia has been in some ways following international crises and trying to preserve its lingering influence in the world. But as you alluded to, it's been incredibly clumsy, ham-handed, almost self-harming in the process of doing so. And coming out of this, Russia has essentially encircled itself with NATO never more unified, countries like China and India distancing themselves in some way from Moscow. This is a situation where Russia is going to be a pariah state. And I think Putin has badly miscalculated.
OK, so whichever way this goes, the world is going to be a much more dangerous and unstable place for the next decade or so.
Oh, yes, I think for more than the next decade. And I think if the U.S. and Russia don't take good steps now, don't take wise steps to sustain some degree of diplomacy, we can imagine a long-term break, a real deep break between the West and Russia that would simply encourage Russia to behave ever more irresponsibly in Europe and encourage the European countries and the U.S. as well to really further deepen Moscow's isolation and set the stage for continuing insecurity, tensions, and crises, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1950s and the 1960s.
Not sure how well I'm going to sleep tonight, but thank you for that analysis. Joshua Schiffrinson from Boston University.
Thank you.
On the diplomatic front, Russia's foreign ministry took aim at Germany today, declaring 40 diplomatic staff persona non grata and ordering their expulsion. That's about a third of Germany's diplomatic corps in Russia. Moscow said the decision was in retaliation for Germany's expulsion of 40 Russian diplomats earlier this month. The German foreign ministry said the tit-for-tat measure was expected but in no way justified. Well, despite its actions against Moscow and its support for Kyiv, Germany is under pressure over its apparent slowness in supplying weapons to Ukraine. Berlin's stance has been particularly criticised by Baltic states like Estonia. DW's chief political editor, Michaela Kufner, discussed Germany's position with the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas.
Prime Minister Kallas, you say you're expecting strong leadership from Germany right now. What exactly do you mean?
What we definitely expect is that Germany is also, supporting all the decisions that we make together and also showing the leadership. In democracy, of course, gas or oil could be expensive, but freedom is really priceless. So if you take the leadership role and also explain what is at stake here. Our neighbors' problems today are our problems tomorrow. If we help to end this war, there will be less war refugees for Germany. There will be less problems regarding economy as well. And therefore, these strong sanctions hitting hard would be something that would maybe end this war, not immediately, but still. So this is one side, and the other side where we expect Germany's leadership is in NATO. I've very carefully followed the discussions that you have in Germany, and I understand what is the starting point here. But if you say that we don't want to go to any other war that is going on somewhere else, I totally understand that. But if NATO is a defensive alliance, we are in this together. Also, Germany has said Article 5 is ironclad, and Germany will come to help if necessary. But then it's also for everybody important, including Germany, to make those decisions so that we make NATO stronger and there will be no need to come to any help at all.
So what do you feel isn't understood in Berlin yet that is understood in the Baltic countries, for instance?
That our neighbors' problems today are our problems tomorrow. If we don't help our neighbors when their house is on fire, that fire will also catch, your house.
Prime Minister Kallas, thank you very much.